There's a moment when the story stops being about one person and starts being about a system. It happens quietly. At first, you think you're looking at an individual case, a name, a scandal, a series of documents. But then something feels off, not because of what is revealed, but because of what isn't. The silence, the delays, the careful language, the way responsibility seems to dissolve as it moves upward. And that's when a more unsettling realization begins to form. What if the most disturbing part of cases like this isn't the crime itself, but how easily power absorbs it? The files don't shock you because they're explicit. They unsettle you because they are restrained. They don't scream. They whisper. And whispers in systems of power travel far. Here is the paradox no one prepares you for. We are taught to believe that power protects society from abuse. Yet time and again, it appears power is most efficient at protecting itself. Not through force, not through threats, but through networks, through silence, through shared vulnerability. When people talk about the Epstein files, they often focus on details, names, dates, movements. But details can distract from structure. They pull attention downward, away from the larger question. And the larger question is this: why do systems built to prevent harm so often become experts at containing it? This isn't a question about guilt. It's a question about mechanism. Power doesn't operate like morality. It operates like gravity. It pulls inward. It stabilizes itself. And anything that threatens balance is quietly neutralized. Not always erased, but slowed, softened, redirected. Consider how rarely power collapses suddenly. More often, it diffuses pressure until outrage loses momentum. Investigations stretch. Language becomes technical. Responsibility fragments. No one person holds the weight, and so no one falls under it. This is not coincidence. Psychologically, power creates a shared incentive structure. Those inside it may not conspire. They simply adapt. Silence becomes currency. Distance becomes protection. Looking away becomes normal. And the most unsettling part? This adaptation doesn't feel corrupt from the inside. It feels reasonable, necessary, professional. This is why cases associated with figures like Jeffrey Epstein linger in the public imagination long after headlines fade. Not because they are unresolved, but because they reveal something uncomfortable about how influence actually works. They force you to confront the possibility that accountability is not evenly distributed. That proximity to power changes not only outcomes, but perception itself. What is obvious from the outside becomes complex on the inside. What feels urgent to the public becomes procedural behind closed doors. And so the question shifts. Not what happened, but what kind of world allows this to happen repeatedly without transforming? What kind of psychological environment allows systems to outlast scandal? What kind of social conditioning makes silence feel safer than truth? What kind of power structure survives by ensuring no single person ever holds the full weight of responsibility? Because once you stop treating these files as isolated revelations and start seeing them as symptoms, you begin to realize that the story isn't about exposure. It's about insulation. An understanding that changes everything about how you see power, protection, and the quiet rules that govern who is held accountable. And who never is to understand what the Epstein files reveal about power, you have to step away from scandal and move toward structure. Because the most important facts in this case are not hidden. They are documented and still insufficient. According to publicly available court records, Jeffrey Epstein was convicted in 2008 in Florida on charges related to solicitation of a minor. The case concluded with a non-prosecution agreement that later drew widespread scrutiny for its unusually broad scope. Legal analysts noted that the agreement shielded unnamed potential co-conspirators from federal charges, a feature considered highly atypical. This detail matters psychologically, not because of who was involved, but because of what the system allowed. Power does not need innocence to survive. It needs containment. Carl Jung believed that when systems face material that threatens their identity, they do not confront it directly. They compartmentalize it, bury it in procedure, transform moral urgency into administrative distance. This is exactly how institutional power behaves under threat. More than a decade later, in 2019, Epstein was arrested again on federal sex trafficking charges. The rearrest itself was not shocking. What shocked observers was how long the previous resolution had remained structurally intact. Not because people didn't know, but because knowing did not disrupt the system. This reveals a key psychological mechanism: diffused responsibility. When accountability is spread across agreements, departments, and legal language, no single individual holds enough weight to trigger collapse. Everyone operates within their role. Everyone appears compliant, and no one feels fully responsible. Jean-Paul Sartre argued that systems excel at dissolving guilt into function. When a person acts within procedure, moral discomfort weakens. Responsibility becomes abstract. This is how power stabilizes itself. Epstein's death in federal custody in 2019 was officially ruled a suicide. Subsequent investigations confirmed multiple procedural failures. Guards failed to follow protocol, and surveillance systems malfunctioned. These findings were acknowledged publicly. What followed was not resolution. It was absorption. The system acknowledged failure and continued. This is not conspiracy. It is institutional psychology. Arthur Schopenhauer believed that suffering persists when systems prioritize continuity over truth. Modern power systems do not deny harm outright. They outlast attention. Investigations extend. Language becomes technical. Emotional urgency dissipates. And eventually, the public moves on. Aldous Huxley predicted this form of control precisely. Not enforced silence, but exhaustion. Information without closure. Awareness without consequence. Even civil lawsuits that followed, some resulting in settlements, reflect this pattern. Accountability shifts from criminal judgment to financial resolution. The system adapts. It survives. And this is the hidden problem. Power is not structured to correct itself morally. It is structured to remain intact. Nietzsche warned that when institutions grow large enough, preservation replaces purpose. Protection becomes reflex. Silence becomes rational. And those within the system often believe they are acting responsibly, even when harm persists. This is why cases like this linger psychologically. Not because they are mysterious, but because they reveal how easily responsibility dissolves when power becomes distributed. And once you recognize that pattern, a more uncomfortable question emerges. If power protects itself this efficiently, what does that mean for anyone who exists outside it? That question leads directly to the unseen consequences, not just for victims, but for society itself. The most lasting damage caused by power protecting itself is not outrage. Outrage fades. What remains is something quieter and far more corrosive. When systems repeatedly absorb scandal without visible transformation, people don't become angry forever. They become resigned. Trust doesn't explode, it erodes. Slowly, subtly, until skepticism feels like realism. This is one of the most dangerous psychological consequences. You stop expecting accountability, not because you agree with injustice, but because expectation itself begins to feel naive. Social psychologists call this learned helplessness, when repeated exposure to uncontrollable outcomes trains the mind to disengage. The public sees investigation stall, responsibility fragment, consequences soften, and eventually, attention withdraws. Not in protest, in fatigue. Neurologically, this has an effect. The brain conserves energy by reducing emotional investment in outcomes that appear unchanged. Moral urgency gives way to emotional distance. Cynicism feels protective, and cynicism spreads. This is how individual cases quietly reshape collective psychology. Not by convincing people that harm is acceptable, but by convincing them that harm is inevitable. That belief changes behavior. People become less willing to speak up, less confident that truth matters, more cautious about challenging authority. Silence stops feeling like complicity and starts feeling like realism. This is how power stabilizes itself socially. Cognitive biases deepen the effect. The normalcy bias tells people that if a system continues functioning, it must be fundamentally stable. The status quo bias reinforces the belief that disruption is more dangerous than injustice. So even when wrongdoing is acknowledged, the impulse is not to dismantle, but to move on. Jean-Paul Sartre warned that when responsibility becomes abstract, moral agency weakens. People don't stop caring. They stop believing their care has impact. This erosion doesn't just affect institutions. It reaches inward. People begin to doubt their own moral intuition. They hesitate to trust their discomfort. They question whether something is truly wrong or simply how things work. And that uncertainty is powerful. It trains individuals to self-regulate expectations, just as systems self-regulate accountability. Aldous Huxley described this perfectly. Control does not require oppression when people internalize limits. When disappointment becomes familiar, people lower their demands voluntarily. The consequence is a culture of managed outrage. Brief spikes of attention, followed by procedural language, followed by silence. Over time, meaning thins. The public remains informed but detached, aware but disengaged. Knowledge no longer leads to action. It leads to commentary. This is not apathy. It is adaptation. But adaptation has a cost. When accountability feels unreachable, people redirect energy away from collective responsibility and toward personal survival. Focus on yourself becomes wisdom. Withdrawal becomes rational. And power benefits from that withdrawal, not because it is engineered by villains, but because systems reward what sustains them. The most unsettling consequence is this. When power repeatedly protects itself, society learns the wrong lesson. Not that justice is impossible, but that justice is conditional. And once justice feels conditional, it stops feeling universal. That belief reshapes how people view authority, morality, and even themselves. It creates a quiet divide between those who feel shielded by systems and those who feel exposed to them. This is why cases like this don't just matter legally. They matter psychologically. They teach people what to expect from power. And expectation governs behavior more effectively than fear ever could, which leads to the final turning point. Because once you recognize how deeply this psychology runs, how it shapes trust, silence, and disengagement, the question is no longer whether power behaves this way. The question becomes, what does resisting this pattern actually look like? And that question leads to the only response that has ever disrupted systems like this. Not outrage, not exposure, but something far quieter and far more dangerous to power. The way out of this pattern does not begin with outrage. Outrage exhausts itself too quickly. The real rebellion against power that protects itself begins with something far less dramatic: clarity. Power relies on confusion more than secrecy. It survives not because people don't know, but because knowledge feels fragmented, procedural, and distant. When responsibility dissolves into systems, individuals begin to feel irrelevant. So the first act of resistance is psychological. You refuse to internalize helplessness. You stop mistaking awareness for participation. You stop equating silence with realism. You stop assuming that endurance equals wisdom. This does not mean constant protest or suspicion. It means resisting the quiet conditioning that teaches you to lower expectations before evidence demands it. Historically, meaningful disruption has never come from exposure alone. Exposure creates attention, but attention fades. What changes systems is sustained moral pressure, pressure that does not collapse in a spectacle. Viktor Frankl believed that the most radical act in any system is refusing to surrender responsibility, even when outcomes are uncertain, even when results are delayed. Meaning, he argued, is created not by success, but by commitment to values under constraint. This is where power feels threatened, not by anger, but by persistence. Psychologically, this rebellion looks small but decisive. You stop disengaging emotionally the moment accountability feels distant. You stop accepting procedural language as resolution. You resist the temptation to move on before truth settles. You allow discomfort to remain unresolved. Nietzsche understood this deeply. He warned that modern systems train people to seek comfort over confrontation. But discomfort, when held consciously, prevents adaptation from turning into submission. The goal is not to dismantle institutions individually. The goal is to disrupt the internal habits that keep them intact. Cynicism is easy. Detachment is rewarded. Silence feels safe. But none of these weaken power. They stabilize it. The rebellion is choosing to stay psychologically engaged without burning out, to remain morally alert without becoming reactive, to care without collapsing into despair. This is not naivete. It is discipline. When enough individuals refuse to internalize power's expectations, refuse to normalize the absence of consequence, systems are forced to respond differently. Not immediately, not dramatically, but measurably. Power adapts to pressure that doesn't dissipate. And the most dangerous pressure is not noise. It is memory, remembering what was acknowledged, remembering what was promised, remembering what never changed. This is how responsibility is reclaimed, not by chasing villains, but by refusing to forget how systems behave when they believe attention will fade. And once that refusal stabilizes, a final realization emerges, one that reframes power itself. At the end of all the documents, investigations, and public debates, a quieter truth remains. Power does not fear exposure as much as it fears memory. Scandals feel dangerous because they appear disruptive, but power has learned how to survive them. It absorbs shock, stretches time, fragments responsibility, and waits for attention to move on. What threatens it is not outrage. Outrage burns quickly, but sustained awareness that refuses to dissolve. The deepest revelation of cases like this is not about individuals. It is about structure. Power is not primarily maintained through secrecy or force. It is maintained through psychological distance. When consequences feel abstract, responsibility feels optional. When systems outlast scandal, people learn to expect endurance instead of justice. And expectation quietly shapes behavior. The most effective form of control is not telling people what to believe. It is teaching them what not to expect. Not to expect closure. Not to expect accountability. Not to expect transformation. Once those expectations collapse, power no longer needs to defend itself. But this is also where possibility returns. Because systems that rely on forgetfulness are vulnerable to remembrance. When individuals refuse to internalize helplessness, refuse to normalize silence, they interrupt the cycle. Not through spectacle, but through continuity. Through insisting that acknowledgement without consequence is incomplete. The ultimate truth is this. Power does not collapse when it is revealed. It collapses when people refuse to move on. And that refusal, quiet, disciplined, relentless, is where real danger begins.